44th FIDE Chess Olympiad 2022 Round 2 recap. A lot of the top teams did well again this round, and I want to talk specifically about the United States team today. JD and I were a little bit harsh on Aronian yesterday. In today's matchup, Aronian sat out. So we had the other four players. We had Caruana, Wesley So, Leinier Dominguez, and Sam Shankland. The other three players all drew their games, so it came down to Dominguez to pull out the win against Grandmaster Jose Fernando Cubas, and I'm going to show you guys that game. So Black is playing from the Paraguay team, and they defeated Palestine 4-0 in the first round. US won 3.5-0 against Angola in the first round. So we see e4, c5, and this is typical for Dominguez. He likes to play e4. And we go into an open Sicilian. We've also seen this from Dominguez in the past. And now e5 by Black and knight to b5. So these lines can get kind of sharp. And the idea here is the knight is threatening to come to d6, checking the Black king. So Black cannot allow that, and Black plays d6. But now we get this kind of interesting imbalance already where there's this backward pawn on d6 that White can apply pressure to. But the positive for Black is they got their pawn up on e5, controlling some important central squares, and eventually Black is going to develop both of their bishops out and play pawn to f5 as a way to break in the center and try to build a big center from the Black side. So now we see c4 by Dominguez, and this is creating a stronghold on the d5 square. This opening is called the Lowenthal or the Kalashnikov variation. And I think based on this opening, we're in for an exciting game. And with three other draws, this was the last game to finish. This is a must-win game for Dominguez to keep the US on 2 points. Bishop to e7, knight 5 to c3. This is the first kind of rare move in the game. Usually, almost all the players put the b1 knight on c3, and then they'll bring this knight back to a3 and c2. It can transpose though, but this is just something where we start to head to our own territory in terms of not following any games very shortly. This is a favorite of a player named Evgeny Alexeyev, and he's had pretty good results with this, and he's played it over the years, even though his opponents are ready for it. So that shows that it's still a good option for White. Knight f6, knight to a3. This knight wants to head to c2, where he can control the d4 square. Try to keep this knight out. There's knight c2. Both players get their light square bishops out. Black lines up the rook with c4, castling by White. All of this is logical. And at this point, White wants to apply pressure on that backward d6 pawn. So we see the queen's already lined up with d6. Maybe this knight heads to b5, pressuring the pawn. Or maybe we can get the queen and rook lined up, bring more major pieces onto the d file. And Black plays pawn to a6. And this is a twofold purpose move. One is to play b5 for Black. The other is to keep that knight out of b5, which would pressure d6. Bishop to e3 by White. This is just a logical developing move. So now White is finally caught up in development. You can see Dominguez has all four minor pieces brought out. Cubas also has all four minor pieces brought out. Knight to d7, and now the players are starting to reposition their pieces, trying to improve the placement of them. Queen to d2. So let's take stock in this position here. We know we have the backward pawn. We know White has a stronghold on d5. What does Black have in terms of counterplay? I would argue that the main counterplay for Black is this move pawn to f5, trying to trade the f5 pawn for the e4 pawn. If that trade happens, Black gets these two central pawns, and you could claim that the big center is giving Black some counterplay for those imbalance advantages that White has. If you look at the engine though, it does say right around 0.5 or 0.6 advantage for White. So pretty good start for Dominguez. And we are 13 moves in. Knight to c5 by Black. This is a very small mistake. This actually encourages a strong move by White, and White gets to play it with a tempo. So instead of playing knight to c5, I think Black should go for the f5 break. And the reason I know this is because I analyzed it with Stockfish and I tried out some different ideas. f5 is a really strong idea for black to try to fight back against this center. And the best way to play it is to start with queen to e8. And I'll show you why. So let's say white puts the rook on d1, applying extra pressure on d6. Now we see f5 by black. White will most likely capture. Bishop takes back. And knight to d5, planting that knight on a really strong outpost. There are no black pawns to kick this knight. But now black has this cool move, bishop to d8. And that highlights the reason that queen to e8 was my recommendation over the game line. Because now black, even though they have this kind of consolidated, almost passive looking position with all of these pieces back here on the 7th and 8th rank, they, black does have the big pawn center, and these pawns are on dark. They work well with the bishop on f5, and the eval here is still right around 0.6. So white has a 0.6 advantage, but I think black has a little bit of play in the position. In the game line, when black played knight to c5 here, this increased the advantage for white over a 1-pawn advantage. So now we're looking at about a pawn and a quarter after b5, and black is on the defensive. This is going to be hard to come back from if black is not able to find some counterplay. And really that should come from f5 still. Knight to d5, posting up that knight, dominating outpost. If black were to capture, white can capture back with the c-pawn, and this is going to be a backward pawn. White's going to still have full control of the position with nice bishops that kind of point both directions. So those bishops are trying to control the full board here. Pawn to f5. At this point, f5 is actually a mistake. So right idea by black, but not the best timing. And oftentimes in my games, I face this type of move in the King's Indian defense. And a lot of times when black plays f5, Stockfish says f5 is actually a mistake. And the reason why is because when you play f5, it does weaken all of these light squares. So you have to be very careful, and you have to calculate clearly that f5 is going to be a good move. Instead of f5, there's an interesting idea here. Pawn to h6 by black. Kind of a clever move, and the idea is this is black's bad bishop. It runs into this pawn chain. This is white's good bishop. It's opposite of the pawns on e4 and c4. By playing pawn to h6, black can actually try for bishop to g5, and even though white could capture twice and double black's pawns, it's worth it for black. Trade off a bad bishop for a good one. So that's something that you can try to use in your own games as well. When you see the good bishop versus bad bishop type positions, can you trade off a bad bishop for a good one? Or if you're the side with a good bishop, can you avoid that trade? So h6, nice looking move by black. But instead he played pawn to f5. E takes f, bishop takes f5, pawn to b5. Now this position is getting pretty tactical, and we see that the bishops are still controlling this queen side, whereas the black bishops are kind of stuck over there on the king side. So those bishops over there on the king side, they're having trouble getting back over to the queen side. Knight to b8, and now knight to b4. Look at these white knights. What white wants to do here is take on e7, and I give Dominguez a lot of credit here. He doesn't rush into this capture. He can take on d7 at any point. That bishop doesn't have any squares to avoid the trade. If it comes out to h4, white could always kick it with g3. g5 is not safe because it's double attacked by white's queen and bishop. So Dominguez is not in a rush to take the bishop. Knight to c5, pawn to f3. This is kind of a nice move. It's prophylactic. It's preventing that black knight from heading into e4 where maybe it could cause some problems. What I like about this game too is Dominguez is very slowly just building up the pressure. He knows when to put the pedal to the metal. He knows when to play it slowly and just build and let black be uncomfortable with a passive position. Pawn to h6. Now black is finally ready to play bishop to g5. So what does Dominguez do? He captures that bishop right before the bishop was going to head out to g5. Queen takes, rook a to d1. Now we have an immediate threat. Queen takes d6, securing the pawn. And notice how white just has full control of this position. White has the bishop pair, and white also has the initiative. So board control, bishop pair, initiative. That all adds up to a Stockfish eval of around 2.4. We can see the eval bar over here on the left. Pawn to a5 by black, kicking the knight. And this knight heads into the outpost. And look at how strong the knight is. It eyes all of these squares in black's position, and it cannot be kicked by a pawn. It can't even be attacked by one of these knights very easily. Knight to c3. So the knight backs out of the outpost, but it renews this threat. Queen takes d6, and this is really hard to deal with. Black actually has to allow the capture and brings his knight back to e6. And look at what Dominguez does, though. He just plays queen to d5. Queen takes d6 is playable here. But he says, you know what? I don't need this pawn. You don't have a good way to defend it a second time. I'm just going to post my queen up on d5. And I'm actually thinking maybe I'll take this pawn, or maybe I'll utilize this pin on the knight and create some tactics. Rook to e8 played by black, and now Dominguez takes the b pawn and leaves the d pawn sitting there. The reason this move is pretty good for white is because now there's a passed b pawn, and those passed pawns can become extremely dangerous, especially when your opponent's position is uncoordinated, like black's is here, and we have the white pieces supporting it. We already see the bishop here, this knight is in the area, the queen's in the area. This pawn is ready to march up the board. Knight to f4 by black. So now we see black getting a strong outpost for one of his knights. This knight could be kicked by g3, but really that's just a powerful piece there. Dominguez doesn't want it sitting on f4, so he takes it off. And now we're starting to look for an endgame conversion as white. Queen to d5 check, also eyes the bishop, also eyes this pawn on d6. Bishop blocks, and look at this. Dominguez does not capture the pawn on d6. A lot of players here would just go for the pawn. The reason that's not good is because after the trade on d6, black can actually take this pawn on c4. We have rook and bishop attacking, only bishop defending. So that would turn out to be a pawn for a pawn. So Dominguez says, you know what, I don't want that trade. Even though the material count says +1, oftentimes when we're up one pawn, we're taught, oh, trade down, you're up material, trade down. You don't want to trade down too quickly, and oftentimes one pawn isn't quite enough to win. So if you have one pawn up and you have a dominant position, maybe don't go for that queen trade so quickly. See if you can create more threats or win more material first before getting the queen trade. And that's what Dominguez does. So he plays the queen back to e4, and this is targeting a weak pawn on f4, right? So this queen is just keeping an eye on all the targets, but he's not going for the queen trade yet. Knight to d7. Both pawns are capturable. But look what Dominguez does. Knight to e4. That's the strongest move on the board. Does not capture either of those pawns. And he actually wants to play knight takes d6, which would fork the rooks. Bishop back to f7. Now you would assume knight takes d6, right? There's your fork. But there is something to watch for. That rook attacks the bishop on e2. And look at this smooth move by Dominguez. Rook to f2, guarding the bishop, renewing the threat of knight takes d6. Rook to e5, now we see knight takes d6, attacking the rook, attacking the bishop, and at this point, black resigns. And the Stockfish eval says plus 9.2. I'll show you why. I'll show you what could happen here. If rook c to c5, so getting the rook off of the square that the knight attacks, now there's knight takes f7, and after the king takes back, queen takes d7 check. So that secures the free piece, and white is also up an additional 2 pawns. So that's completely losing for black. What if rook to e7? So allowing this exchange to be traded, knight for a rook. Well, then we have knight takes c8. Oh, I lost my place. There we go. Knight takes c8. Queen takes c8, and queen takes f4. So white not only got the rook for the knight, but he also got an additional pawn. And again, we're up 5 points of material from the white side, looking at a plus 9 eval. So I really like this game by Dominguez. I think there's a lot of good takeaways. One of the biggest ones was just when you control the board, don't look to cash in just when you win back one pawn. Right? If you win one pawn and you still have full control of the board, keep applying pressure to your opponent and don't be in such a rush to cash in that advantage. So that was kind of the theme of the game. Dominguez just showed really good class and patience in the fact that he didn't try to cash in that advantage too early. All right, so let's take a look at how this affects the standings now. I'm pulling up the chessresults.com page. It looks like old school HTML, but this page is really good with syncing with the tournament results. So here's the standings after round 2, and I'll just kind of explain what this is. We have a rank of 1, so there's 9 teams tied for first place, and their tiebreak 1 is actually their score in the event. So a win counts as 2, and a draw counts as 1 point for the team. So 4 points for tiebreak 1 means 2-0 for your team result. There are 9 teams currently 2-0. So we have Ukraine, India 2, all the way down to Canada. India 2 is one that I personally really want to see do well, so that's kind of exciting for me. And then United States is down a little bit. So we see here in the second group, 10 through 24, we do have India, we have Norway up there, and these teams have 7.5 game points. So that's this tiebreak 3. Instead of a perfect 8 out of 8, they all have 7.5. We see Brazil, Australia, Serbia, and then coming down here, 7 game points. We have Poland through Switzerland. Here's Iceland, 6.5 game points, one of JD's favorite teams. And down here is the United States of America, 6 points. So US had 3.5 out of 4 in the first round and only won that last match 2.5 to 1.5. So 6 points, currently in 37th place. So let's see, how do the pairings look for round number 3? Go here to the team pairings. And we have India against Greece on board number 1. And for the pairings, they mainly look at the team scores. So board number 2, you see United States of America still. That's because our team is 2 out of 2, the US team. So we are still sitting on board 2. India is still on board 1. They're the second seed, but they're the host nation. And then board 3, we have Italy against Norway. That's going to be a good matchup. Italy is the 26th seed. Norway is the 3 seed. Spain and Brazil on board 4. Australia and Poland, board 5. Azerbaijan, Argentina, board 6. Sweden, Netherlands, board 7. All of these teams have perfect scores. And we actually have perfect scores all the way down to board number 22. So a lot of strong teams still on a perfect score. Tomorrow is the 3rd round. Let me know in the comments, what did you think of today's games? And keep posting which teams you want to see us do coverage of. I think JD will be back tomorrow to join me. And I appreciate you guys watching. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you in tomorrow's recap.